Art Nerds, you guys might remember these Paul Rubens watercolors from my art supplies from Wish Unbox and Swatch. Today we are putting them to the test with this adorable Makoto Takahashi inspired watercolor illustration. So if you want to see how these paints handle, keep watching. So these Paul Rubens watercolors arrived in this really nice gift box. Now, if you guys didn't watch the unbox and swatch video, you definitely should. But these are Chinese watercolors. So these are watercolors made in China for the Chinese market. They came in a really cute pink tin, and they came with watercolor swatch paper, and I was fairly impressed by the colors inside. You guys will have to check out my initial unbox and swatch video for a price breakdown, but I am eager to get to painting. So for this, ooh, boy, this was a mistake because now I can't get this out. I'll just have to revisit this later, that is. This sketch was done on grabbing it, dropping it, Fabriano Medievalis art paper. So it can be used as a mixed media paper. And I used to do a lot of my field tests on this paper. The slightly smaller than 4x6, I guess it's like 3x5-ish. Anyway, it's a perfect size for field tests because it's just enough for me to know whether or not the paints will work without being overly committed. So I went ahead and attached it to a piece of chipboard using some blue low-tack tape, and I'm eager to get started. This is a 24 color set with a fairly good range of most colors. We've got a good selection of yellows, reds, blues, greens, and browns. Some sets do tend to prefer one type of color family over another, and a nice mix of cool and warm colors. So this should be a really good mixing set if the paints themselves perform well. I've got my materials laid out, my brushes, the palette I'm going to use, a cup of clean water, and a pipette. Got this mounted to a piece of chipboard. I think I'm about ready to get started, and I want to begin with, I think, the background. Now, typically I like using blues for these sort of floral illustrations, but I do that a lot. Blue tends to be my de facto color, so I might go for something obnoxious, maybe a yellow or this sort of sap green here. However, maybe I should instead start with my flowers first and then do my background. So initially, this red seemed to lift a little bit chalky, definitely picked up a lot of pigment from the pan, sort of blended it out here in my nice round larger palette. That does seem to be something worth paying attention to, worthy of concern, is how opaque are these colors going to be? How many optical brighteners are used in order to give it the vivid colors that it has in the pans? Because they're very bright in the pans. And like I've mentioned, I think in other videos, nicer quality watercolors can sometimes be very dark in the pans, and that's why you do need to swatch. See, as you can see, it does pick up a lot. So I did a little bit of blowback or wash back with a little bit of water just to see how much it would push the paint around. Have a little bit here that got out of the border, so I'm going to grab a paper towel and clean that up. Do seem to be drawing a little bit dull. I don't know if you guys can tell that. I'm sure it'll be obvious once I do another layer though. These have had a chance to dry, so I'm actually going to go in with a less floppy brush. Squirrel tends to be very, very soft, so I'm going to use a Kolinsky Sable brush. Now, the palette these Paul Rubens watercolors come in is quite nice. It's comparable to other watercolor palettes. With my tube watercolors, as you guys probably know, I either have to buy or find a palette to store the half pans in. So it's really nice to do half pan videos because they usually come with their own palettes. And the metal palette for the Paul Rubens is not only cute, but fairly sturdily built. I'm having a little bit of control with the watercolors, and I'm not sure if that's me or the weather outside because it's quite humid today, it wants to storm, or if it's the watercolors themselves. Let that dry and see how that looks. All right, so those flowers are still drying, but I definitely want some, let's see, maybe some red violet in there, as well as some blues, because I do think I'm going to go with that green for the background. So I have red violet right now. And I need to be careful because this area is still wet. So what do I want to be red violet? And for some people, color theory and selecting colors that work, it just comes naturally to them, or it seems to come naturally to them. But for me, I feel like I have to spend a lot of time thinking about it, and even then sometimes there's a high failure rate. So I tend to stick to kind of safe things, and what this is going to end up looking is it's going to end up looking pretty basic palette, I fear, but it is what it is. And really, it's just a field test just to figure out whether or not these watercolors work well, or whether they become chalky, whether they have difficulty layering, all those sort of problems that really tend to present themselves, not when you're swatching, but when you're actually trying to do something. And I want to save the yellows and the oranges kind of for the insides of the flowers. So that's also something I need to think about. But I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit of really nice warm yellow and do the inside of this flower here kind of carefully, because I don't want it to touch the purple and bleed all over the place, because I know that's going to be an area that's going to be harder to do if I wait. All right, now I want to do a couple of purple flowers. I'm basically working my way through red, dark red, red violet, purple, and then probably ultramarine. And I should probably use the Kolinsky rather than the squirrel, or maybe even something tighter than that. And since I have a tendency to kind of overwork my watercolors, I'm trying to leave some of the white of the page still visible. Hopefully then we'll get a little bit more contrast and a little bit more visual bounce, which will result in a more vibrant, lively illustration. That said, I'm also a little hesitant to overwork these because I just don't think they've really got what it takes for a lot of working. But I guess we're going to find that out as this kind of progresses. Alright, so unfortunately I did this off camera, but I'm going to explain what I did. I just put down a light cerulean blue. This color, let me see if I can show you guys. It's this one here. This color looks like it's actually quite or fairly opaque, or would be fairly opaque. It's fairly watered down here. There's some interesting granulation going on, which I like granulation, so I don't see that as a problem. I'm dropping some in now, wet into wet, allowing it to kind of disperse out. And then after this dries, I'm going to go in here with the last blue I'm going to use, which looks more like it might be a like an ultramarine rather than a cerulean. Just kind of encouraging that. It seemed to dissipate out so much that we lost like the wet to wet bloom effect. But for the last flower, the one hiding way back there, I'm going to use the ultramarine, and then we can start doing the centers. So this blue has had a chance to dry. Now we're going to do our final larger blue. I think I might do an orange here for this, and that's going to be like a nice pop of color to kind of direct your interest over to Kara. But I think I'm going to do the darker blue here and over here. Now I'm trying to get a really dark blue to kind of shade the ultramarine I have here. So I mixed some of the other blues together as well as a little bit of purple because it was getting a little too cool. Just so that we get some depth, because otherwise it's really going to look kind of flat right there. Actually, I can probably mix a little bit of that with the cerulean because the cerulean got a little too dark. And I'll probably end up shading that a little bit with purple. Now, in the past, I've had a lot of trouble with cerulean because cerulean tends to be very lift happy, very prone to reactivating and lifting, and also tends to be very chalky and has a tendency to feather out and kind of pollute other areas. So that's definitely something I'm going to be watching for in this field test. Go back in and kind of tighten up some of the details on some of these flowers. And I know people use Wish on YouTube right now kind of as a joke, like, oh, everything there is garbage. So with some of the watercolors that I've purchased from there, I sincerely wanted to see if they're any good because they're pretty affordable. I think the Pabio set and this set were both $30 each, which for 24 half pans, if they perform decently well, that's not that bad. So I kind of figured it would be win-win for me. Either it would be hilariously bad or, you know, maybe we discover something new together. And so far they're not hilariously bad. Like, I've definitely used worse watercolors. You guys have definitely seen me use worse watercolors. We're not far enough in for me to decide whether or not they're worth 30 bucks. But we'll get there. And another selling point is that Wish takes PayPal. So I was able to use Patreon funds to help support these reviews, which is always a nice selling point for me. I'm just kind of working with the next color down the line, the color adjacent in the palette to just shade. And I mean, so far we haven't had any catastrophic failures. The Paul Rubens don't have like an overwhelming smell the way the Pabio watercolors did. I had to let those air out for several days. And that watercolor test should be coming up really soon if you guys are curious about those. Now I am using a nice brush with this. The set did not come with a brush, so I'm using my own. And I'm also using, don't know if you guys are able to see it, but one of these kinds of palettes, which I actually really like for these sort of single standalone illustrations because it has large wells and I can do a lot of color mixing. You can pick that up at Jerry's, not on Wish, but I'm sure you could if you really, really need to do all your art supply shopping on Wish. I'm sure you could find that on Wish. But I basically decided that I'm not going to buy art supplies that look like they're comically bad or intentionally a knockoff through Wish. I know a lot of people are doing that, and that's fine, but I don't want to spend my money that way. I want to use Wish to find things like buy water brushes, for example, things that like you don't need a brand name for it to be good. Or maybe get a chance to try some Chinese watercolors like I'm doing with the Paul Rubens here, and like I'll be doing with the Pabio, because even though that's a French brand, those are manufactured in China for the Chinese market. So I'm basically just using it as an opportunity to play with materials that I would not have otherwise had access to. I mean, I do enjoy comically bad art supplies. That's what the whole Burn It box thing is about, is like intentionally comically bad art supplies, but I do also get tired of looking at and reviewing those kind of art supplies. So sometimes it's nice to just go in with, like, you know, a pure heart, open expectations, hoping to be impressed. All right, I'll give all of that a chance to dry. So now I can start with some of the interiors of the flowers, as well as this little orange flower right here. So far, the colors in this Paul Rubens set are very intense, quite saturated. I do think they're probably full of optical brighteners. I do think we're probably going to face some problems a little later on in this video. I'm trying not to do too much to accommodate for that, because that's not an accurate representation for you guys of what the paints handle like when I accommodate for that. I feel like my painting on this is very sloppy though. This seems like it's a very bright, very saturated palette, so it may be a little difficult for some of us to comfortably use. And I mean comfortably as in within our comfort zone. So, on that note, what do you guys look for when you're buying palettes? What kind of color selection do you want? What sort of working properties are you looking for? When you're buying a watercolor palette, what kind of goals are you trying to achieve? For me, I like colors that blend together well, will work with other palettes, like other brands of watercolor. I can intermix colors and it's not going to separate out or get really weird. I'm looking for light fastness properties. I'm looking to avoid optical brighteners, which make your colors appear very bright until, you know, they've had a chance to dry and then they're not so bright anymore. Although I like affordability, and that's been kind of something that's kept me from certain palettes or certain brands for a while. I don't mind investing more money in order to get something that's going to behave, you know, in the way I want it to, or in order to get something that is going to stand the test of time or last longer. And with cheap watercolors, you do tend to burn through them very quickly because they're full of optical brighteners. You're mixing more color to get what you're looking for. They sediment out, they turn to mud very quickly, so you may end up repainting things a few times. Just kind of doing some wet into wet floating techniques. I mean, we're really picking up a lot of pigment, which isn't good, because I don't want that much, and I'm kind of wiping it off. I'll zoom out so you guys can see. I'm wiping it off into my little side palette over there, so it's not even necessarily getting used, and it makes it harder for me to control my brush. And I should note I didn't pre-activate these pans either, because I remember from the swatch video they had a tendency to do this. Watercolors that use a lot of optical brighteners have a tendency to just kind of slough off onto your brush, right? To cake up on your brush, to really gunk up on your brush if you pre-activate them. So you want to work as dry as you can. Now with the Magello Mission Gold colors, those, and the Holbein colors as well, those are from a tube that I allowed to dry in a palette. Same goes for the M. Grams and the Sennelier. They tend to get a little soupy, but that's because they are tube watercolors that were not really designed to be used in half pans. These are half pans that I'm using as they're designed to be used, that are turning kind of goopy on me. But that doesn't mean they're unusable watercolors by any stretch. This is just something, a working property or an issue I'm facing that I want you guys to be aware of. So if you decide that you want to try this set, you want to use this set yourselves, it doesn't take you by surprise. You know what you're getting into when you're using this set. So I want to do the background, I think, in 2 different shades of green. So what I think I'm going to do, I have a feeling this is going to end up getting more complicated than I intended, but what I think I'm going to do is I think I am going to go ahead and start with the lighter green and then go in with the darker green. We'll see how that goes. What I'm going to have to do, clean that out because that ended up being kind of dirty. But I'm going to try to mix enough of it, and maybe I should go change out my water, but I'm going to try to mix enough of it so that it's not drying too much as I'm going. As you guys can see, that's pretty opaque. A lot of optical brightener in that, I think. And for those of you who are not familiar with optical brighteners are typically additives like calcium or chalk, something to make it appear bright. You're adding white. Appear bright, it makes it opaque, but it also makes it prone to lifting. So hopefully this will kind of give the appearance of like dappled sunlight. Now, colors that have a lot of optical brighteners in them also tend to dry fast, so it actually changes the working properties that you expect from the colors. So they're not going to behave the way, if you've used those colors with other brands, they're not going to behave anything like those other colors. They tend to dry a lot faster, so your open time is actually very short. And you may end up having to overpaint things or overwork things in order to get the effect you want. Now, I have, in my time painting and doing tutorials, I've met people who are unfamiliar with watercolors, and they think optical brightener sounds just like a great idea. Like, oh, it's going to make the colors more opaque. It's going to make them more vivid. That's more vivid. That's what I want. That's great. I don't want to do a lot of layers. But what I can't seem to convey to them enough is that there's a strong possibility that they're going to make your watercolors chalky. And it's not something you can necessarily predict. Sometimes it depends on the water you're using. Sometimes it depends on the humidity outside or how hot it is, how quickly things dry. Optical brighteners in your watercolors really do change how the watercolors handle, and it can make them a lot harder to use. So, I mean, companies do it to make inexpensive watercolors look really nice and really good and tempting in the store. But it's something that for my own painting, for when I'm painting Cara pages or when I'm painting other types of illustrations, I really try to avoid messing with paints that have optical brighteners. And I can't think of any brands that I intentionally will grab that utilize those kind of brighteners, because I'm painting a lot of pages, and it's just like an unnecessary thing, in my opinion, for me to have to worry about. There's nothing I'm getting from those paints that is rewarding enough that I'm willing to overlook the issues I'm going to have dealing with those paints when I'm trying to actually paint something. So I'm going to go change my water out. That's another thing with optical brighteners, is they muddy your water really fast. I'm going to go change my water out, and then we can get started on Cara's skin tone. I've got a fresh cup of water. I'm going to grab a little bit of what looks like it's probably an indigo, but it's kind of trending towards a neutral tint. And I'm going to use that to go ahead and do a little bit of shadow color at the tops of her eyes. Now that that has had a chance to dry, I'm going to mix up some skin tone using their yellow ochre, which yellow ochre usually tends to be kind of an opaque color to begin with because it is an earth pigment, or earth pigments do tend to be a little more opaque. Probably water this down a bit more. This looks like it's going to be a little too dark. So what I think I'm going to do is I think I'm going to apply it to Cara's skin and then kind of wash it out. Although Although it's kind of drying normal. I don't know. With inexpensive watercolors, this is always like it's probably going to dry very, very light. So what do I do with that kind of situation? A wait and see would be a good term. See, because now on her cheek down here is too light. So I'm going to have to bring in some color to kind of remedy that. Another thing about cheap inexpensive watercolors, cheaply manufactured watercolors, is that they have a high tendency to reactivate and bleed into your other areas of color. So when you're adding water, when you're doing kind of wet applications, you want to be kind of careful about not overlapping too much in an area where the color, if it was going to bleed, it would be very staining and very noticeable. Lift out a little bit of what's on her hand, and now we let it dry and see how that turned out. All right, I'm not that impressed with that, but that is okay. I'm gonna go ahead and do a more saturated layer. I'm gonna work kind of sporadically, or I guess kind of carefully, choosing particular areas, and then I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to do shading. So the skin seems to be drying a little bit chalky, which isn't surprising. With yellow ochre in general, there are times when if you really, really layer it on, the skin will dry kind of chalky and will kind of occlude the line art, but it's usually not that noticeable. But with cheaper watercolors, it really starts to become kind of a noticeable issue, and it kind of contributes to the muddiness of the piece because it decreases the contrast. And just in general, it's less pleasant to work with when it does that. All right, I'm gonna mix up a little bit of pink. That can be used as a skin tone. And let's see, I still have that center of a flower to paint. So I think I'm going to grab a little bit of the cerulean blue that we had earlier. Although I have a lot of blue going on right there. Maybe I should go with purple instead. All right, so the skin has had a chance to dry. I want to zoom in so you guys can see whether or not we get any color lifting, because that tends to happen a lot when you do very light glazes. So far, so good. Now I'm going to blend this out a little bit, and we're going to let it dry. Okay, so now that that is dried, it's actually pretty non-noticeable. Let's see if we can make it stand out just a little bit more without going too far. And then next, we're actually going to need to paint. And zoom out for you guys. This is a true test, in my opinion, because once this dries, we're going to do the shadow color on our skin. And that tends to be when things get really weird. They start getting muddy. I've been trying to work on over-rendering less, since that does seem to be a reoccurring problem for me. So, be interesting to see how I handle that problem. Alright, so before I start painting her skin, I'm going to do the shadow color. Or before I start painting her hair, I'm going to start doing the shadow color on her skin. I'm going to use the red violet that was included in this set. There's probably a little bit of purple mixed in. This is when things look really nice at like when it's wet, and then really sad after it's had a chance to dry. So it's like bad magic. A magic trick in reverse. But we'll see. Maybe it won't be bad magic, and maybe we'll be happy. Alright, we'll let that dry and see how it looks. Alright, so that wasn't so bad. Now I'm going to go in with this already very chalky brown. And I'm going to try to water it down just a bit, just because it's going to go on very opaque and thick if I don't. So something I'm trying to do more of is allowing my paints to actually mix on the page. And with a set like this, which has so many pre-mixed colors, I mean, I feel like it's really not harmonious like this. It's a very disjointed sort of illustration. And I mean, it's a field test, so to an extent, you know, we're just testing as many colors as we can, trying to show as much range from the set as possible. And it doesn't actually matter if the end piece looks good, it just needs to describe the paints we're using. But on the other hand, I am an artist and I am judged by the quality of my work. So when I do a bunch of reviews where, you know, I can answer your questions, but the piece looks bad, it doesn't make people want to click it. They don't want to look at what I'm doing. So there is an incentive. And I mean, it's very discouraging for me as well, because like, I don't like making ugly things. I don't like making things that will serve no purpose. I don't want to show anyone, you know? So there is, even though I am doing the field test to figure out whether or not the paints are any good, there's definitely an incentive to try and make something that's going to be visually attractive so people will take me seriously. If all I do is paint ugly illustrations that, you know, help me figure out whether or not the set is any good, but no one else cares because they don't trust me enough to watch, I don't know. I feel like I've attained all this knowledge that doesn't serve myself much, and it doesn't serve others very much. So there is a push for me to try and make attractive pieces, but still test the boundaries of the paints and still test out all the colors that I can. But sometimes the end result is a little gaudy for me. I mean, these definitely handle like a cheap watercolor set. They're not necessarily the worst I've used though. Like for example, the Lucas Aquarelle Studio set I reviewed, that definitely handles worse than this. That was a lot gummier, a lot chalkier than this. The Banyo watercolor set I reviewed, also worse than this set. I couldn't really build up color gradation. I would almost say this is on the same level as the Yarka student set I reviewed. It's not as full of glycerin as that set, but like the color depth and what I'm able to do is very similar to the Yarka set. Now the Yarka set is a lot cheaper than this set. The Yarka set, first of all, Yarka, you can get that pretty easily in the US. You don't have to get it from Wish. Secondly, it's considered like a children's grade watercolor set. It's a very nice children's grade watercolor set, and I would recommend it for anybody who's like looking to dabble in watercolor and they're maybe on a budget. I would certainly recommend that set over this set for a lot of different reasons besides just that. I mean, I feel like $30 was too much to pay for this set, but it did come with a nice tin, and it did come with its own half pans. I'm kind of comparing it to my experiences with some of the other Asian watercolors I've used, which are very bright and very vivid and very finely milled. But I had to buy my own half pans, and I had to buy my own palette because it didn't come with its own palette. They were two watercolors, so I had to fill them myself. And I have no idea what color to make her dress, so I'm gonna have to think about that for a moment. So I think for her dress, I want to do some yellows and then cooler blues. And that way we will have tested, well, I'm gonna also do some of the darker browns for her hair, but that means we'll have tested a lot of the colors in this set. And that will make this a very bright piece. But just because it makes me uncomfortable doesn't mean it's bad. A lot of people like very bright colors. That's one of the complaints that I've gotten before, in Kidlit is that I don't use enough bright colors. So, you know, pushing out of my comfort zone, handling colors and color schemes that I'm less comfortable with, can chalk that up just a good practice. So even if I don't like the piece, you know, I've practiced some things that pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit today. Ooh, that is like a highlighter yellow. I don't even know if the camera is doing it justice, but that is a yellow. A very yellow. I'm gonna try floating the warmer, almost yellow orange. They didn't really include kind of a middle of the road yellow. I think that helps with the fluorescent a little bit and give that a chance to dry. But next, I'm going to go into Kara's hair and do another layer of darker brown. Now with Kara's hair, eyebrows, and eyes, I usually do 3 layers, starting with kind of a Venetian red and then going all the way to sepia. I try to keep her hair red-brown. And I'll let that dry. So that has had plenty of time to dry. And as you guys can see, I'm picking up a lot of paint. My paints have also had time to dry, so it's not like water's just been sitting on them. They've had time to dry as well, but they are very quick to, I wouldn't say reactivate so much as just cake up on my brush. And to me, that's definitely a sign of cheaper watercolors. However, for cheaper performing watercolors, they don't perform poorly at all, but I can't help but think about the Como Rebi set that I reviewed not so long ago, the Mozart Como Rebi set. That's $25, so it's cheaper than this set. You can get it on Amazon Prime, I believe, so you're not paying for shipping, and with Wish, you know, sometimes you end up paying more for shipping than you're thinking about. And it performs a lot, that set performs a lot better than this set here, and you get 40 different colors, and they're whole pan size, not half pan size. So if you guys are looking for inexpensive watercolors and you're kind of thinking about this set, because I keep referring to these as cheap watercolors, I would like to point out that these are not that cheap, and that I would highly recommend you guys go for the Como Rebi set. It's one of my big picks for inexpensive watercolors. I really like that set. I enjoy using that set myself. I've had good experiences with that set, so if you're looking for a recommendation, that would be my recommendation, is that particular set. So I'm activating some sepia so I can get started on her hair. Well, started finishing up her hair. And now I'm going to shade this yellow dress with just a little bit of red violet. I find if I go too cool when I shade yellows, they tend to just look really muddy and gross. Now I need to let that dry before I can get started on the blue accents. So now that that has had a chance to dry, I am going to go in with a really nice, cool blue. This one here at the bottom. And water it down a little bit so we have a little bit of color variation on her sleeves, as well as on the button on her dress. I want to go a little darker than that. I also think I want to do a bit of a pattern on her dress, maybe something with green and small blue flowers. actually really starting to like this piece a lot better. The only thing I'm really having a problem with is the green in the background is a little too chromatically intense. What I might end up doing is doing a couple of other greens on top of it. I want to keep that mottled, sun-dappled sort of thing going, but I definitely want it to be darker towards the bottom. And, oh, that's a blue. This might not work. This might be a failed experiment, but we may have learned something in the process, which makes experiments worthwhile. And that's why we experiment, right? I think it should work. I think what might hold it back is the paper and the paint want to dry very quickly tonight. But otherwise, I think it's a solid idea. Okay, so that's already, I think, a little bit better. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of the emerald green and a little bit of a darker kind of sap green. And hopefully this will not have dried too quickly because I do want it to kind of diffuse out. And I also don't want it to lift up the prior layers. And it does seem like it's kind of dried in place, so I'm just going to have to work with it, but I definitely think this is helping because it's kind of introducing a little more contrast to the background. Everything was kind of chromatically very high key, which is one of the problems I have when I do very saturated pieces, is that I tend to do everything very high saturation. And it usually tends to only be something I realize is a problem when I'm almost finished with it and it's too late. Adding just a little bit of yellow here and there. I'm going to try to wash that out. I thought the paper was still wet enough that it would diffuse, but it doesn't seem to want to. That's a good yellow, though, for doing foliage kind of stuff. So, as you guys can see in this corner, the green did start to lift up. So I'm going to try doing a heavier application of it. Sometimes with cheap watercolors, that's really the trick, is you just have to slather it on. But otherwise, it looks decently good. I would be interested in trying this set again with more muted colors and relying more on color mixing to really get an idea for how it handles, because I feel like this was great to test out all the colors, but I feel like I didn't really get a solid idea of how these would actually work for me. And I have done some color layering and some color blending on here, so, you know, I don't know why. I feel like I didn't really get a solid idea. The pans themselves are pretty soft, not too grainy, not too granular. Even as I add water, they're not really, like sometimes with Winsor & Newton, for example, or other half pans that are designed as half pans, they get kind of rough on your brushes and can start to tear your brushes up. These seem like they were very finely milled, so I haven't noticed that as an issue yet. That might be a later surprise, but it's not an issue as of now. And while I think there are probably optical brighteners involved in these paints, as I've mentioned probably a dozen times in this video, it's not as bad as some brands. If I have any Chinese viewers, I would love to know, A, where you can get these, and not on Wish and probably not on Amazon or eBay, like what kind of stores would sell these paints. And I'd like to know how much, if you guys don't mind giving me a $2 American comparison. If you can't, I can look it up myself, of course. But I'd also like to know how much they cost in China and whether or not that varies depending on the region. I know in the US, or I can tell you in the US, that art supplies really do vary by, accessibility and where you are in the country. And they also vary in price from, inexpensive big chain stores like Dick Blick will have them for much less than like small mom and pop kind of stores. That's going to start lifting up this cerulean blue. So these are, they do kind of want to lift. At least some colors want to lift. And would these be considered, like, what kind of quality would these be considered in China? You guys kind of invented, or you guys definitively invented watercolor. So it would be, I'm kind of curious how these stack up to what's available. So let me know. I love learning about art supplies from other countries, and I love learning about, you know, the sort of techniques that artists from other artistic traditions utilize. I also know that some of the art supplies in this country that are considered like full-blown adult art supplies are considered children's grade, like Caran d'Ache. A lot of what we get over here that's Caran d'Ache is actually their children's line, and it's being sold as adult art supplies here, which I don't know if that's marketing or if they just think we all draw and paint like children. I'm not really sure what's up with that, but that would be an example of like how the product is marketed, what demographic the product is marketed to being very different. I am going to add my finishing touches and talk about how I feel about these watercolors, and I'm going to do that using Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. You guys have seen me use this plenty of times. I'm going to grab a nice stiff synthetic brush so I can get in there and do all those details. So I have here a Ebony Splendor by Creative Mark. And I often find that when I add the white details, that's really when everything really starts to come together and the piece feels more lively. Now there's plenty of color going on here, so I can't imagine that this is going to add too much liveliness, but we'll see. So while these weren't the worst watercolors I've ever used, I certainly wouldn't say they're worth $30, and I certainly wouldn't say they're worth the hassle of only being able to find them on Wish or eBay or, you know, those sort of sites. There are plenty of nicer, better watercolors that are cheaper, that are very commonly available, either through like Dick Blick and Jerry's Artorama or through Amazon. So you don't really need to go to great lengths for these watercolors. They're not worth all that. I paid around $30 for the tin. I like the tin itself. It's a nice quality palette. The paints are all right. They're not anything innovative, exciting, nothing to really write home about. I mean, they're color in a half pan. I don't know. They don't particularly granulate. They have a lot of optical brighteners in them. Some colors are more prone to lifting, but I didn't have some of the problems I typically have with inexpensive watercolors, like, you know, really bad feathering or bleeding. I'll be interested to see if I do have any Chinese viewers, and I'm also interested to see how they feel about these watercolors and what these cost in China or in other countries where they might be more commonly sold. But I certainly would not recommend you guys go out of your way to get these. You're not really saving any money, and they're not really filling any niche that isn't being filled by something a little bit more accessible and a little more affordable, at least for those of you who are in the US. If you don't have access to Western brands, or Western brands tend to be prohibitively expensive in your country, and you see these, they're not bad. I would be afraid to do anything too rendered or too detailed with them. I do think they're going to lift up on you. I have doubts about how light fast they are. They're fairly opaque. But if you don't have a lot of options, you don't have a lot of options anyway. I would say I kind of want to compare them to Sakura Koi watercolors. Yeah, they kind of do handle like Sakura Koi watercolors. So I would try to limit my layers. I would try to limit my mixes, and I would be prepared for the colors to get muddy and opaque quickly. So if you just kind of work light and with that in mind, I don't think you'll have too many problems. That said, if you're looking for an affordable watercolor set with a lot of colors and you don't want to spend a lot of money, I really recommend the Mozart Como Rebi set. I've reviewed it and done a field test on this channel. I have another field test where I did a Western style watercolor. I really like that set. That's a set I grab even if I'm just watercoloring for fun. Sometimes with these field tests, I paint with the set once and I end up gifting it to someone else because I just don't really care for what's in it, or I can't see myself working it into my normal watercolor rotation. But I really like the Como Rebi set and I would recommend that over this set. It's available on Amazon. It's $25 for 40 whole pans. It includes metallics and fluorescents, which normally don't impress me because they tend not to be archival or light fast, but it's got plenty of other nice colors in it as well. And I really can't see it performing any worse than this set. Not that this set is horrific, but you know, it's just not, it's not anything to write home about. So I hope you guys found this video to be helpful, useful, informative, or inspiring. I hope there was something from this video that you can take with you into, you know, your painting life. Today we took a look at the Paul Rubens watercolor set. This was purchased from Wish, and these are Chinese watercolors. It's not a bad set, but it's not a great set, and I wouldn't go to any trouble to try and get a hold of this set. It does come in a rather lovely, if I can find it, a rather lovely gift box, quite well made, with a polishing cloth inside, which really makes it feel a lot fancier than it is. If you're trying to give a gift to someone who's new to watercolor, who doesn't know much about watercolor, this set would impress without breaking the bank, but I hate to encourage anyone to deceive someone else like that because they might be in for a disappointment. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you again really soon. I'm going to be working on the Pabio field test next. So if you're interested in more art supplies from Wish, keep an eye on this channel for that. And I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you again really soon. For more of my watercolor tips, tricks, and tutorials, keep an eye on the channel, consider subscribing. And if you're looking for more in-depth, maybe even written help, check out my blog at natosoup.blogspot.com. If you'd like to see more of this little cutie, head on over to my webcomic, 7inchkara.com or 7inchkara.tumblr.com to read her adorable adventures. These videos are made possible with a lot of help, in no small part from my dear patrons on Patreon. My patrons do get early access to these videos. So if you want to binge watercolor videos before anyone else can see them, head on over to patreon.com/natosoup and find out how you can join the art nerd community. So I'll see you guys again really soon. Bye guys.